Well, hello once again. It is time for another episode of Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. Oh, and our guest today is Rie Gilsdorf, and she's going to yell at me because I didn't include equity. I just said inclusion and diversity, but that's okay. We'll get to that. Rie is a big picture person, as she will tell you, and she has master's degrees in biology and dance, which is pretty unique, and a lot of other kinds of things to go along with that. So I think we're going to have a lot of fun today. I am certainly looking forward to it and looking forward to learning a lot and having a wonderful discussion. So Rie, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. It's good to be here.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to have somebody who comes on and really does look at the big picture. So we'll get there. But
yes,
let's talk about you growing up a little bit, your childhood and all that. Sort of how did you get somewhere and moving forward and all that?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is I grew up in California in a small town, and
what town?
Santa Ynez, California.
Okay. Oh.
So also very close to Solvang that more people have heard of, right? With the cookies and the Able Skewer.
But Zaca Mesa wine comes from Santa Ynez.
Oh,
so.
yes, it does. Yes, it certainly does. And lots of other good ones.
Yes.
When I was a child, my dad was in agriculture. He was an animal nutritionist, actually, and he worked mainly with large animals, cattle and horses. And so our fortunes were directly tied to those markets, which are very cyclical. And so what would happen for me is I started out my educational life in a private school. And then the bottom fell out of the cattle market and I landed in a public school. And then I would be there for a couple of years until some egregious thing happened, like, they're going to put 24 children in one classroom, which, of course, by today's standards, there are teachers that would kill to have only 24 children in their room, right? But back in the day, that was just unheard of. And so then
when was that roughly?
That would have been in the late 60s.
Okay.
So, then I would move to a private school and we'd be there for a few years and then the market would fall and then I'd go back to public school and then some awful thing would happen. Then I'd go back to private school. So even though I grew up my entire childhood in one house, I went to 5 different schools. So for me, I didn't have language for it at the time, of course, but there were cultural differences between those programs, right? So I would say things like, as a 7-year-old, I said to my mom when I first went to public school, Mom, they wear their tennies to school. Because at the private school, there was a uniform and you had to have leather shoes. And then you came home and you changed into your play clothes and your tennis shoes, right? So I didn't understand what that meant, or, socioeconomically that, not everybody has shoes for every occasion, and that it's fine to wear your tennis shoes to school. It was just different to me. And over the course of all my schooling, I think the message that I got was there are more than one way to be. There's more than one way that's considered normal in different places. And so there's a skill of figuring out what is called for and how I need to be in different places.
When you were growing up and you made that comment to your mom, I'm curious if you remember, what did she say?
I think she just said, "Oh, honey, that's just how, that's just a different school and they just have different ways." And, she sort of just minimized it. She didn't really talk about it much.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So anyway, I think that like looking back on it, I think that's really, how I first began to understand that there's more than one way to be, right? And that things that seem perfectly normal in one environment are like really not normal in another environment. And that, wow, there's the way that we act in my home is not the way that everyone acts in their home. So then, fast forward is that I go and I get a degree in biology, and I get a degree in biology because, my dad in agriculture thought that would be great because I could go to vet school, or I could go to med school, or I could go into research, or I could, so I was didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I did that. And then I actually got a master's in zoology and animal behavior. And it's very interesting if you want to learn the skills about observing and describing. Animal behavior is a great place to start, because you don't know what that sparrow is thinking, but you know that he's trying to get to the top of the dominance hierarchy, and he's like, there's a literal pecking order, and he's pecking on the next slightly smaller sparrow, right? So there are things I think I learned about describing that, as opposed to interpreting and laying my story on, that have been really helpful, because as much as we are all humans and we all share, one physiology, and, there's a lot of really lovely sentiments about, we all smile in one language. And also people have really different experiences, and it can feel like you're being erased if somebody who has more power or is a little more dominant in the situation just sort of is like, oh, we're all alike, comma, you're like me. We're all alike, Michael. You're just like me, except for that you're blind and I'm not. But I'm just going to say we're all alike. So there's something that's just a little, again, it doesn't capture the big picture. We have to go out to the big picture of people's different experiences and needs, and then we can come back in to the immediate picture of, okay, what does everybody need right now? And how are we alike? And how are we going to be one group here today?
But what really got you to the point where you emotionally and intellectually understood the value or need for the big picture?
Oh, you know what? That's an excellent question. Part of it is, I think that I have kind of always had a propensity for that. When I was about 12 or 13, a pastor, actually, who was a friend of my older sister's, said to me, you know what, you're a middle person. You can see both sides, and people are going to try to make you choose. And really, your gift is to see both sides. And it was one of those moments where I knew that he had said something profound, even though, like at 12, I wasn't quite ready for it to be that profound.
Sure.
But then, then the other piece is, then I go and I get a degree in dance, and, my mother is beside herself, because, like, what are you going to do with these two things that are so, a science degree and an art degree, and but really, I can see that it's all about the body, and there's, cognitively understanding how the body works and the systems and all of those kind of things. And then there's physically understanding what it is to inhabit your body and express something or understand body language or that sort of thing. So I think that, it was probably in those years when I was, getting my dance master's. So I would have been in my 20s when, I began to really go, okay, wait, there's a bigger picture here. And even in dance, people were saying, you have to choose. You have to either be a teacher or a performer. You have to either be a choreographer or a teacher, and realizing, like, well, no, those aren't, why couldn't a person do both of those things? Life is long.
Yeah. And everybody always wants you to make a choice according to their definitions. And of course, that's the real issue. Yes. Is it's their view, and they don't look at other views that may cause them to stretch and grow because they're too comfortable with the one thing that they know.
Yes. Very well said. Very well said. Yeah. And because, for that person, making some drastic choice early in their life might have been a really smart decision for them. It might have been the best choice they ever made, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right choice for me.
Yeah, it is an interesting world we live in, and it's all too often that people just don't see the value of a big picture. And I also think that it is important that, although you see the big picture, it's important to be able to bring it back down and focus in on whatever it is that you have to deal with, the endeavor or whatever at the time.
Absolutely. Zooming out and zooming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you
climb up
got
the
to do
mountain
some.
and get the view, and then you've got, because if you stay the whole time with your head in the clouds, really, then you're not practical. And that's, there are people who use the big picture to kind of bypass. They get to the we all smile in the same language place, and then they don't get to, like, okay, well, how are we going to make that work?
Right. Where did you go to college?
I took my first degree at Occidental College in Los Angeles,
Mm-hmm.
which is a small liberal arts college, which was a good step for me coming from a very small town, going to a smallish college. I think if I'd gone to Washington State, which was my next step, which had probably 30,000 students at the time, that would have been too big of a step for me at the time. But yeah, then I went to Washington State for my science degree, and then I was dancing all along, and I had in my head this old trope about how, if you don't make it in dance by the time you're 30, your career is over, and so I didn't allow myself to realize how much I loved dance and how it could be a career path, until I was almost done with my zoology master's. And so then I went to the University of Utah because they have a great choreography program. And also, by the way, they have what's called the kinesiology program, dance kinesiology. So that's the study of the body in motion. And so that was really kind of a sweet spot for me. It really allowed me, again, to develop both halves of that. Although, I was the first graduate student in their history to write a thesis and produce a concert. Like usually if you're a choreography major, you're going to produce a concert. And if you're a science major, kinesiology major, you're going to do a thesis. And I was like, no, I really want to do both of these things. So
You had a lot of fun doing it.
I sure did.
What made you pick combination of science and dance, though? They are very different in a lot of ways, which isn't to say it's a good idea or not, but what made you do both of those?
Well, like I said, my dad had a science background. He was an animal scientist, to be exact. And so really, I got my biology degree just to be compliant, and my mom said to me, don't worry if you don't know what you want to major in. Go start your biology major and you're going to a liberal arts school and take a lot of classes, and you're going to meet some professor that just excites you and sees your potential, and you're going to just want to hang out with them and learn from them. And then you'll know, that's where you should go. And I got into my senior year of college and I was really disappointed because I thought, oh my gosh, I never met that professor. What's wrong with me? And then I realized that actually it was my dance teacher. And because dance was an adjunct subject at that school, she wasn't a professor, right? So then what happened was I went up to Washington State because I'd gotten a teaching assistantship. And by the way, that's where I fell in love with teaching, because there were graduate students who had research assistantships and teaching assistantships, and the research assistant people were like the people with the spotless transcript and the they were like, that was the prize position, and other people were like, well, I guess you're gonna have to teach. And then even among teaching, I got assigned biology 101, a basic class. And I loved those beginners, and I realized that I actually had a gift for helping make things clear to beginners. So I went up there and I was part of a dance group, just as an extracurricular thing. And, the poor fortune of my professor there was that she was going through a very messy divorce and she was depressed and she didn't really have the wherewithal to run the group. So she turned it over to us. And so then that was my good fortune, because that's where I found choreography. And I was like, oh, wow, you could keep choreographing. And, it wouldn't matter if if you were aging. So that's where I really got turned on by, got bit by the choreography bug, and then, finished out my thesis and went on down to Utah from there.
Wow. So then what did you do once you had these 2 degrees? And You had to go out into the workforce and do something with them all.
Exactly. So for a long time, I had a day job.
Good to have one of those occasionally.
Yes, got to have those. And then interestingly, some years later,
what was your day job?
Oh my gosh, I had a sequence of day jobs, but I'll tell you the most astounding one is I worked at a medical clinic, because growing up I had worked in my dad's office, so I knew how to do office things, and I worked at a medical clinic in the collections department, and like I'm not exactly who you would think of as a collector, I'm just not, firm in that way. Like I'm not someone you think is going to break your kneecaps at all. Right, and so that was a rough job. And then actually, one of my first kind of mind body jobs was the last year we were living there. We were living there because my husband at the time was getting his degree at Cal Poly University in San Luis Obispo.
San Luis Obispo, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so I actually got offered a job being the physical therapy assistant at a day program for disabled adults. And they mainly were folks who had mild cognitive impairment and significant mobility issues. So a lot of folks that had had head injuries or cerebral palsy or those sorts of things. And I part of how I got this was that in college, I had done a semester with a professor who was really a pioneer in dance for folks with disabilities. And so I remember calling her because I was so nervous that I'd been offered the job. And I said, Anne, I just feel like, how will I know if what I'm doing is hurting them? And she said, oh, well, there's a way to know. And I said, what is it? And she said, well, you ask them. They've been living in their body their whole life.
Hello.
It's like, oh, duh.
And how often we don't, in all seriousness, and how often we don't. We on one end of the scale, we think we're the experts, and so we don't need to ask. And I've seen that so many times. And the other end, we just don't think about asking, even though it's the logical thing to do, and we don't view ourselves as the expert.
Exactly. Or there's these scripts about how it's not polite. Like when your mother has taught you that it's not polite to look or point at someone who is different, right, who has a disability, then that gets internalized. Well, I'm certainly not going to talk about it. But, they've been living in their body their whole life. They would certainly rather, my clients would certainly rather have me ask them than like try some idiotic thing that does hurt, right? So anyway, so that was really one of my first places of combining, because we were doing physical therapy, but it was so, such a sort of great outlet. And then I of course put some dance in there, and then from there we moved to Colorado, and then I was able to work in both it was probably a for-profit college. It's called Denver Technical College. So I was able to teach, anatomy, physiology, those things there. And then there must have been a baby boom like 3 years earlier in Colorado Springs, because there were so many preschool programs that wanted to have a creative dance thing. So I was teaching, college kids at night and little 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds in the daytime. So that was a little schizophrenic, but lots of fun. And then we ended up moving to Portland, Oregon. And at that point, there was an arts high school being built. And I ended up getting hired into that program. And amazingly enough, you had to have an art and an academic to teach full time, because they put the academics in the morning when people's minds were fresh. And then they put the arts, which are all things that you physically do, in the afternoon, and which also are things that kids, tended to love. Yeah. So they would like show up and focus and, and all of that sort of thing. And because I had a background in biology and dance, I could teach full time there. Mm-hmm. And it at the time was when it opened, it was an alternative school. So it didn't matter like that I didn't have the right licensure, and really not very many states were licensing dance teachers in those days. And then along comes No Child Left Behind, and they had requirements for being a quote unquote highly qualified teacher. And even though by that point I'd been teaching dance and integrating, I mean, part of that program was that we integrated the art and the academics together, because we knew that children learn what we all learn. We don't learn in a box, right? Like I never really thought a whole lot about math until I had to replace the floor in a bathroom and I had to figure out the flooring tile, right? There was a lot of math in that. So the learning by doing thing is very important. So anyway, I was very happy as a clam there for 10 years. Then No Child Left Behind came along and they were like, well, you're going to have to quit and you're going to have to go get your teaching degree. And in fact, it means that you're going to have to student teach in someone's classroom that probably has less experience than you. And I just couldn't do it. I mean, a lot of my colleagues did it, bless their hearts. But at that point, then I got a principal's license. And then shortly after that, I ended up moving to Minnesota to be the principal of a different arts high school.
You certainly moved around a lot, from California to Colorado to Oregon and then Minnesota.
Exactly. Did a lot of moving. Yep.
So was it all because of you or husband, or was it jobs related, or just you guys decided you wanted to see different kinds of snow?
Yeah, well, you know, we did find that both Colorado and Oregon are the Birkenstocks with socks states. So, so we moved to Colorado for his job, and then he was really sort of burning out from that job, and he had gone on a trip to Portland, actually a whole bunch of West Coast cities, and fell in love with Portland. He said, you have to come out here and see this. So we up and moved to Portland just because it felt really good, and managed to both get jobs there, and then moved to Minnesota for my job. He was then the trailing spouse, as we say. So
when did you move to Minnesota? What year was that?
Moved here in 2004.
Okay. 2004. And then you put your principal's license to work.
Put the principal's license to work. And as I got hired in that job, the superintendent who hired me he told me this little story about how the year before, the prior principal had 11 openings for teachers, which, I mean, I think there were only about 25 teachers in the school. So that's a huge number of staff.
Yeah.
And despite, you know, some pressure to diversify the staff, had managed to hire 100% white, able-bodied folks. And even when those folks were, you know, like met each other for the first time, you know, like at the back to school, you know, welcome new teachers kind of event, they were kind of surprised and disappointed. And so this superintendent said to me, if you can't hire at least 50% diverse staff of color in particular, you will lose the trust of your faculty. And so I thought, wow, okay, so he's telling me that this is very important. And I'm not sure I know how to do that. So at that point, I leaned into what I didn't know and started my educational journey. And really, it was probably about 10 years after that I ended up kind of really fully going into this work. But I think that's another really important point is, you know, like this, it's the same thing as asking people what their preference is or what, you know, what they need or whatever, that, you know, leaning into what we don't know, like there is no shame in that. None of us knows everything. And if you try to fake like you know things, then you're not really going to make progress. You've got to say, wow, okay, can I go to this conference? Can I pull together this learning group? Can I try this? Can I try that? And that's how we progress.
Did you happen to think of asking any of your faculty members for help and ideas about how to hire a more, at least racially diverse population in teachers?
Yes, definitely.
Oh, good.
Because like often a lot of the wisdom is in the room, right? And there also are people that have networks of, beyond, I mean, certainly, especially as I was a brand new person in Minnesota, it's not like I knew a lot of people here, and other people did. So, yeah.
Well, and you'd already had lessons in the value of asking. So that's why
Yes.
I asked that question.
Yes, definitely.
Well, so what do you do today exactly?
So what I do at this point is I have a little company. I'm a sole proprietor. It's called Embody Equity because, of course, I'm going to bring the body into things. And I kind of do this on two levels. So there's the personal level where people need to, myself included, we need to learn how to listen to our bodies, which sometimes means quieting our minds and our mouths. And we need to overcome some of these fears and biases. I love that in one of your taglines, you talk about how we can't be inclusive until we tackle what's inside of ourselves. And I think that is so true. And very often people will understand cognitively why it's a good idea to be inclusive and all of those things, but they can't quite, when a situation happens, things come out of their mouth or they make decisions that they perhaps aren't real proud of or wouldn't have if they'd had more time to think or whatever. And a lot of that is because a lot of these fears and biases are things that we hold in our bodies. And again, if we've been trained that it's not polite to think about that or talk about that, it's certainly not polite to feel a feeling that doesn't feel good about another person. Mm-hmm. And so part of that is just like learning to feel into that feeling, allow it to come over you, understand what it's coming from, and then you can get to like, oh, well, that's a silly thing to be afraid of. Like that's nothing to worry about. Or, oh, wow, I guess that person might have a different perspective and maybe I could listen to them. But if you start from the body, then you can understand that, a lot of wisdom and a lot of opening up can come out and a lot of letting go can come out of working with your body. So really, I also like to say the body's like that person in the meeting that doesn't speak up until the end of the meeting, and then they open their mouth and they just wow you that this amazing thought comes out that sums everything up, and clearly they've been paying attention the whole time. Your body's like that person in the meeting of you, your mind, and your body, right? Your body's the one who's like very quiet. They're not going to assert themselves, but they know a lot, and a lot of it is getting the mind to be a little quiet so we can listen to the body now. So that's one level. And, sometimes people even come to me for coaching on, gosh, I have a new daughter-in-law that's a person of color, or I have a new coworker, or I'm supervising this group of people, and I realize that I'm acting nervous around people who are different than me. So those kinds of things, I can do coaching on those kinds of things. And then the other thing is whole organizations need to embody that DEI statement that they have, right? Or that eloquent thing that they came out with after some hideous situation was in the news. And they wanted to differentiate themselves, and they said, we stand with the cause. And yet then they don't actually know how to, as an organization, stand with the cause. So really what I do is I look for, I have gotten in the habit of looking at people's documents, like personnel manual, job posting, those sorts of things, and finding the language in there that is pushing for the status quo. Because it's going to be in there because it's been written like, companies occur out of a status quo. Companies, churches, schools. In fact, I thought it was fascinating. You had told a story about being in a church that was considering putting, I think, an elevator in place. And what was fascinating about that, Michael, is the pushback on that sounds exactly like the kind of pushback that I hear about other situations that are about race or gender or other aspects of diversity. So see, that's where like I'm so tempted to then like, ooh, let's come out to the big picture. What is this consciousness that people are inhabiting that I'm only safe if things stay exactly like they are? And there's something vaguely unsafe about us putting an elevator here because someone different than me is going to come to this church, and how like if you really just play that tape on out to the end, like the logical end of that statement, that's ridiculous on the face,
Well, it
so
is, and it totally violates the doctrine and the precepts of the church to not be inclusive, and it happens a whole lot more than we would like to think. Some people just think they own the church. It's theirs. It's not theirs the last time I checked. But, it is amazing. And there's so many things. It's not ours. We're a part of a community. And the sooner we truly recognize that we're part of a bigger community, the better it will be all the way around. But as much as we hear it takes a village, when it comes to us, we don't like to think about that.
Absolutely. When I was at that first art school in Vancouver, Washington, where, you had to have an art and an academic to teach full time, that meant that we all shared classrooms because I might be in a classroom in the morning that was suitable to do science in because it had sinks and counters and that sort of thing. Well, that's also a great kind of a room to do visual art in and mixed paint. It's not a great room to dance in. So I was going to go to a gym or some other large room to teach dance, and an art teacher was going to come in behind me. So we all shared not only the children, but also the rooms and the resources. And as we were planning the school, our principal actually instituted what she called the my jar, which is kind of like the swearing jar in some families. You have to put 25 cents in if you say a bad word. So if anybody said my kids, my room, we had to put 25 cents in the my jar. And let me tell you, that was quite an education about this idea that it's ours. It's not mine. It's not mine. And it was hard. It was surprisingly hard. Again, even though on a cognitive level, I was all about this community, it took a couple of years to really learn how to live into that.
Yeah. And it is one of those things that all too often we don't learn very fast, and we should learn it more quickly. It isn't, there's no I in team. It's what it really comes down to. And there's a lot to be said for that.
Exactly.
So when did you actually give up being a principal?
I did that job. I will tell you that job, the thing about the State Arts High School is that it is a line item in the governor's budget. It's not a regular school district. And the governor appoints your school board. So I was politically over my head almost immediately because, came from out of state, didn't really get Minnesota politics to begin with, and then had these board members who may or may not have really been interested in being a board member, may have donated to a governor's campaign, and so I left there after 3 years, but I went to another school they had a brand new position opening up that was an arts department chair. So that was lovely because then I got to really do a lot of coaching of teachers, which is one of my favorite things, watching teachers teach and coaching them was really a lot of fun. And then though that was a private school and I missed, oddly enough, the public school environment of like really, in a public school, you accept the children that come to your doorstep. And in a private school, you have to go looking for diversity. And so it's just a slightly different mindset there. So I went back to that school, and then that's where I really met the folks from Courageous Conversation, because that school was what was called an integration district. It's something that there had been a number of, I want to say in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so it was a joint powers district of Minneapolis and the 11 surrounding suburbs, because what was found was that different suburbs were able to segregate themselves by having their own school district. And so this was a way that all of those districts had to submit an integration plan. It got very wonky, but
Yeah.
what we did, one of the things that we realized was, okay, so different kinds of children are going to these different districts, and these teachers, it's not like normal neighborhood change has happened and you have, a few kids who are different than you one year and then a few more and a few more, and you gradually learn your way into it. It's like suddenly now they've got a busload of children coming from this other part of town. And then they would do these things that just, like sometimes just getting out of yourself and seeing, having a set of outside eyes is really important. So for instance, there was a suburban school district here that was majority white, and they started getting a busload of mostly Black children in. And those children, like that bus was arriving like at a slightly earlier or later time. There was something weird about like the timing and what was going on at the front entrance. And so they just decided that they would have that bus come to the back door, not thinking, what does it look like when the Black children have to come through the back door? Like, what's the inclusion message there?
Yeah.
Like, ooh, and given our shared history in this country, what's the message there? You know? So yeah. So we put together this thing that was called the Cultural Collaborative, that was a learning exchange for teachers and, and school administrators. And one year my boss said to me, because at that point I was like the curriculum integration specialist. So I was helping people pull the arts into the academics, and by the way, look at how we can have different kinds of kids work together on arts projects and learn from each other and just have the experience of being together. So one year my boss said to me, we have this one company called Courageous Conversation that's coming in, and they're doing a lot of our classes. And then we have a whole bunch of other people. And I would like you to take as many of these classes as you can and report back to me just as a quality control. And so in 1 year, I think I took 36 different 1 and 2 day courses. I mean, I probably should have written up another master's degree for that. But having 2, I didn't feel like getting a third. But at that point, I learned a lot more of the technical pieces of it. And then there was a huge budget issue, and all the people who were teachers on special assignment, in other words, who didn't have a classroom like me, got laid off. And so after that, I ended up going to work for Courageous Conversation, which was the consultancy that was providing a lot of that. So I worked there for about 6 years. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, by that time, I had discovered social presencing theater, which is the physical discipline that I'm working in now. And of course, when you work for someone that has conversation in the name of the business, and you say, hey, I think we should do some movement seminars that aren't so heavily talk oriented. They said, our brand is conversation.
Conversation comes in many forms, however.
Comes in many forms, exactly. So, at the beginning of the pandemic, of course, conversation was not a good idea in person. Mm-hmm. And so they laid off almost all of us. And at that point, I just knew like, oh, okay, right. So now is the time for me to really pull this together and figure out how this works. How do I work together with people to really embody equity? So that's how I got there.
So you started your company then somewhere in the early 2020.
Yes.
So it's about 3 years old, which is good. But you talk about equity, and you don't talk about, or you don't have in your name, inclusion or diversity. Now, why is that?
Yeah, so that's so here's the thing. I think that diversity and inclusion are weak tea compared to equity, and I'll tell you why. Diversity is the easiest thing to measure because you can measure diversity just by counting, and there are many categories that people disclose or are just visible. And so that in a way that's the easiest. What does your C-suite look like? Who's in there? Who's not in there? Right? Inclusion is there's a great book called The Person You Mean to Be by Dolly Chu, and she talks about the metric of inclusion is how did your last meeting go? Like who was talking, who was not talking, who was even allowed in the meeting, so that's one way to think of it. I first really heard about inclusion when I was working at a school, and the parent association of the elementary part of the school had decided that if birthday invitations are going to be handed out at school, then you have to invite everyone in your class. And so I decided that that's a really fitting metaphor for inclusion because I'm going to invite everyone to my party. And, of course, we're all offered the same cake and the same punch and whatever, but it's still my party. And I might not be playing music that you like, and I might not have a cake that you like or that you're even allowed to eat. And by the way, you have to bring me a present. So in a corporate sense or in a school sense, inclusion means I'm going to make some overtures to make you minimally comfortable. I'm going to acknowledge that you're here and that you might have a couple of different needs. I might make a few accommodations as I am required to by law. But the program was designed for me and for people like me. And so equity requires you to pull back and look at the big picture and say, okay, if you have a diversity problem, what's the pipeline? Why aren't people finding their way to your business or organization or church or whatever it is? What's going on that is off-putting or that is disqualifying for people? And in the inclusion realm, equity is going to say, okay, well, what are the cultural things that you are doing that, you're like a fish in the water. You don't see your own culture, but people from outside your culture for sure can see it. And so what are the tools that, how can we expand your tool belt for equity so that you can respond to multiple kinds of people and so that it doesn't feel like a little weird exception has been made for this one person?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have to think about that and what you've said. My general experience is certainly diversity does not include disabilities because as a society, we still believe disability means a lack of ability. And I think that in reality, we can change words. We can change definitions. We don't need to create necessarily new words. So diversity doesn't mean disabilities anymore because that's what everyone has allowed to happen. So from my perspective, I won't accept, and I encourage people not to accept that inclusion doesn't include disabilities. Either you are inclusive or you're not. It is a quantum, one way or the other. There is no partial inclusion. You either fully include all or you don't include anyone. And that disabilities are not things that mean a lack of ability, but rather disability is a characteristic. And so my point of saying that is you are a person with a disability because you're light dependent. And and the reality is if the lights go out, power goes out, you run to find a smartphone or a flashlight or a candle or something to keep light because mostly the world has invented technologies to continue to allow you to have light all the time. And so for some of us, that's a catching up and technology is getting better, but still intellectually, society doesn't accept that. So they don't include, for example, my need for a screen reader software package as opposed to using a computer monitor like you use. Although inclusion ought to be part of the cost of doing business, period.
Yeah. Okay, so on the big picture, I'm fascinated because what just came to me when you're talking is one could think of the desk lamp that I have in my office as an assistive device. It allows me to work past 5 p.m.
Yep.
Whereas you would not need that assistive device. And the thing is, none of us thinks of my desk lamp as an assistive device, whereas
but
if
it
you have
is.
a screen reader, it is. And in the kind of historical equity work that I do often, there's a lot of talk about affirmative action and who does that benefit and so on. But we don't think back to the 40 acres and a mule thing that actually after the Civil War, the idea was that the enslaved people who had been freed were going to get this little land grant so they could start their own farm and do their own work. And then that was actually reversed after a while under that Andrew Jackson administration. But meanwhile, what were they called? The Sooners and the Boomers, who like went through Oklahoma and everything, they were given like more acres, a mule, and several sacks of grain, right? So that was affirmative action for white people, right? So because if you were white and indentured, you could get that. So there are these things where we don't think of it as affirmative action for the dominant group, but that is how the dominant group got dominant. And then I would say we also don't think of assistive devices for the dominant group, but that's part of what keeps us dominant.
But the reality is that assistive technology was mostly first invented for the dominant people.
Yes.
The dominant I won't say race because it's different races, but the dominant force. And what happened as a result is that occurred, and those who were not classified by the dominant people as part of the dominant group were left behind. And it has become worse, which is very unfortunate, but that is the reality of it, that in fact, assistive technology was invented for you long before it really was invented for me. Now we could take it the other way. So Apple, for example, has put assistive technology in every one of its devices. If you go buy an iPhone, you can take any iPhone and activate a screen reader called VoiceOver, and it will verbalize whatever is coming up on the screen, except that they haven't mandated that app developers make sure that they accommodate VoiceOver necessarily as they're creating their app. So an app can be accessible one day and not the next, but leave that alone for the moment. What I don't see Apple doing still is saying, we've got this great verbal technology, audio technology, and creating new and better ways for you light-dependent people to be able to use it. For example, when you're driving a car, you don't turn on VoiceOver so that it will tell you who's calling. And so you have to still look at the phone to see, or you have to look at the phone to answer it. And as much as we talk about safe driving and all that, we encourage people to look elsewhere other than just the road. Look at Tesla. Tesla uses touchscreens to control most of what goes on in its cars. That means, you do have Copilot and so on, which in theory work to some degree, but why is it that we discourage people from continuing to look at the road and not use the other technologies that in reality benefit me, but would also benefit you and would benefit me more if we did it right? So the Tesla, for example, it's all touchscreen, so I can't turn on the radio. I can't change a radio station. I can't do anything with it because it's all touchscreen. And we don't accommodate that stuff. We don't recognize the value of things like audio output and using even audio input more, because we still have the dominant group that doesn't recognize that in reality, alternatives might improve their lives as well.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure. And you know what you're saying about it being, because it's visual, it's distracting. My son has an electric car, not a Tesla, but it is like it's difficult for me. Like I have to set things and adjust them before I start moving in the car because it's too distracting for me, So interesting.
Yeah. And it would be very easy to make the world much more inclusive for all, but it is a mindset change that we have not developed yet. But we need to have that conversation and really encourage it because it would make life better. In 2010, the National Federation of the Blind worked to get a law passed called the Pedestrian Enhancement Safety Act. More and more cars were going hybrid or totally silent or becoming very quiet. So we don't hear them when they're coming down the road a lot of times.
Yeah.
And a law was eventually passed saying that cars needed to make a noise. Now they're still working on deciding what noise to use 12 years later, which is unfortunate, but leave that alone for the moment. The law didn't really get traction at being passed until NHTSA, the National Institute for Highway or Transportation Safety and so on, until NHTSA discovered that there were 1.5 times as many accidents that would happen to pedestrians as a result of encountering a quiet car or hybrid vehicle than would be encountering just a regular internal combustion engine. So when they discovered that other people than people who happen to be blind also were affected by quiet cars, then people's attitudes started to change. We're still not dealing with the inclusive mindset, and we need to.
No.
Well, you started your company, and so what exactly do you do today?
Well, I do a couple of things. I do what I call equity audits. I'm beginning to switch that name around to cultural ways of being audits, because there are 18 different things that people do that are called equity audit, right? Like sometimes it has to do with going in and having focus groups of people of color and saying what's working, what's not working. And so when I hear that, I refer to that as a functional audit, like what is going on, what's working, what's not working. And what I do is more structural, and it has to do with really looking at those hiring documents, policy manuals. I've done audits for, churches and like larger dioceses of churches. I've done a couple that have to do with what's the route to becoming a clergy member, and how is that, like, what's the application, what's the selection process, what are the criteria? Because if your organization was founded by people in the dominant, the words are going to express that, and they're going to express it in a way that is, it's hidden in plain sight. It's just absolutely hidden in plain sight. So one of the main ones. Let me back up and say what I love about this approach is, where I used to work, they would just come in and they would do a seminar that was about equity and diversity, right? And it's very easy for people to launch that into the abstract realm and not bring it down to earth, right? Like, oh, well, theoretically that could happen, but surely we don't do that. Like, I don't, And so it's really lovely to come back with a report that says, here are these things that are in your documents. And can you see why then when you go to hire someone who is different on any axis, that there's this conversation among the hiring committee afterwards, and they say, I just don't know if they're a good fit. And they're not a good fit because, your hiring document hasn't captured, what do you hope to gain from this more inclusive atmosphere, this more inclusive hire? And if all you can say is, well, we want more people who are different, then you need to think more about, like, what are the unique perspectives that people could be bringing to you? And you write those into the job description. And then magically, guess what? More different kinds of people apply, and They answer the questions in such a way that shows what they have to offer. And at the end, the conversation is not about like, they don't quite fit. It's like, wow, they've got some perspectives we really need, right? So anyway, one of the things that comes up often is this idea of professionalism.
Mm-hmm.
That's a word, I'm not advocating that we go away from being professional. Each profession has some standards they need to have, right? But if you don't define it, then it falls back to what does the dominant group do, right? And all the other things are considered unprofessional. And so one of my favorite things that I love to do is if I'm talking, for instance, to a white group, I say, what was the consequence in your childhood home for showing up to supper late? Or another way to think of that is, what was the vibe in your house when you had to get the whole family bundled into the car at the same time to go somewhere to be at a place on time? And I don't know, Michael, what was it with consequence in your house for showing up late to dinner? Was that a bad thing?
Was a bad thing. Unless you had let mom or dad know in advance and there was a reason for it, which is a different animal. But if you just showed up late, or even getting everyone in the car, well, there were only 4 of us, mom, dad, brother, and me. So it was pretty easy because we had a 4-door car, so everybody had their own door. But still, there were expectations that you abide by rules,
Mm-hmm.
and the rules could change, and the rules were created to accommodate everyone.
Mm.
And I think that's part of the issue, is that when you're making rules, if you have rules that don't work for some people, then that's a different animal too.
Right. Well, and then the other piece is, over time, we attach values onto these forms. So like, punctuality is a good thing. When I go to the doctor, I like that, they haven't slipped me down 18th in line when I had an appointment, right? But I'm sure you have been in a meeting, because I think we all have, where somebody said, we're going to respect everyone by starting and ending on time, right? And of course, like today, you and I have an appointment, we're going to try and start and end on time. But if one of us had to leave because there was a family emergency, if you had to run out of the room right now, I wouldn't feel disrespected.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to feel disrespected. That's just a story, a cultural story that's been told. And another story to just like tie this one up in a bow is that I recently had a hip surgery, and I was in the hospital, and one of my excellent nurses was this Black woman who was an African immigrant. And she was very charming and hospitable and trying to get my mind off of the pain and all that. So she would chat me up and everything. She asked me what I did. And so I was telling her about this. And I asked her, like, what's the consequence in your childhood home growing up for not getting to supper on time? And she was like, she couldn't get her head around the idea that there would be a consequence for that. She was like, well, are you kidding? It's like our value is hospitality. And whenever you show up, we're going to try to show you the most hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
And we grew up in a different culture, and it's not that they don't have values, it's that they're pulling out a different thing to value more highly than the actual punctuality, right?
Yeah.
And so I had to appreciate that. And the other thing that I love about this story is, I appreciated that she was punctual in checking in on me to see if my pain meds had worn off or not, right? so that she could help me manage the pain by not letting it get like way too bad and having to take an extra dose and all that sort of thing. So the reason I'm saying that is that often, time is a great example because we all have some experience with time.
Yeah.
But what will happen if people don't want to understand this, and I honestly think it's a willful thing, they'll say, you're saying that Black people can't tell time. And I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that there are different tools to have in our arsenal, in our tool belt. And one of them is when to be sticking to the agenda and getting people through so that we can leave here on time, and when to like bend the agenda to attend to somebody's needs, and when to just straight up be hospitable and say, hey, it's a party, show up when you need to. So all of those are possibilities, and it's about becoming aware of what the water that you and your fish are swimming in.
And that's exactly the point, is that there is something to be said for all of those things. And there is something to be said for if someone is late. Before you condemn, understand. And that is just something that we don't see nearly as often as we should, which brings up the point of there are so many people today who are afraid of saying the wrong thing, and how do you deal with that? Because what really is the wrong thing? And I think that we can define, and we do define the wrong thing, if you will, in terms of like how we deal with people who are different than us and so on. But we also don't really know how to deal with that.
Yes. So there's, oh boy, there's a whole lot about this because there's, am I overhearing someone say the wrong thing? Did somebody say the wrong thing to me? Did I say the wrong thing and realize it when it was halfway out my mouth, but I couldn't call it back, right? So let's start with that one, because that's the easiest one to me is, if you're just genuine and say, oh, that didn't come out at all like I wanted it to, I'm so sorry. And can we talk about how that landed on you? And just own it, because things come out of our mouth, right? And I think most people understand when you do that.
Yeah.
So again, just like being honest with it. I am a big follower of a woman named Loretta Ross, who is all about what she calls calling in instead of calling out. And her whole thing is, you need to admit that other people's interior lives could be as complicated as yours, right? So if somebody has said something, who knows what was going on in their mind? A lot of times we make an assumption, we jump to a conclusion about like, oh my gosh, how mean they're being, or how racist or biased or whatever it is. And her idea is, first of all, if it's happening online, you need to take it offline. You need to have a private conversation, because a conversation about something that has harmed someone or, really touched a nerve, that does not benefit from having an audience. It just doesn't. So taking it offline, talking about it and listening to the other person to see, like, what did you mean when you said this thing? What did you mean? Like, because that is a thing that we don't know. Like we might assume, and sometimes they really did mean to be mean, right?
Yeah. Well, there is always that.
There's always that. And if that's the case, you can do what's called calling it off, which means you say, wow, I'm starting to get kind of upset in this conversation, and I feel like I'm not very grounded. And so I'm going to end this conversation. And then it's up to you whether you want to come back to, like if it's a relative of yours that you care about, maybe you come back when you're both cooler, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it's a random person who was trolling you online, that you just block them, block them and move on.
Or if it's somebody who may be a stranger or not a friend, but you decide, well, maybe I handled that wrong or whatever, and it wasn't intended to be mean, but it's not either of the first two things you described, then you figure out a way to go back and deal with it.
Yes, exactly. And there's even another possibility that there's a woman named Sonia Renee Taylor that has suggested, is that, like, if you're just too exhausted by the situation and you don't, because if you're going to call someone in, that's probably even a series of conversations. Yeah. It's going to take some investment of your time and emotional energy. But you could also say, Michael, I have heard many of your podcasts, and you are such a compassionate human being. And that just doesn't square with that last thing that you said, whatever it was. And I would just like you to think about that. And then, I don't have
to help me understand it.
Or help me understand, right? I would just like, So you can put the work on the other person as well.
Yeah. Well, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. If you do it in a constructive way, that should always be a reasonable thing to do.
Yes, absolutely. And then the only other thing is, if you're, for instance, a university president, like someone with a significant amount of power, and a group of students is protesting a thing and they've called you out, One of the things that Loretta Ross says about that is, you have just gotten thousands of dollars worth of consulting feedback for free.
Yep.
So the thing again is to stop, listen, ask, engage, understand what they're trying to tell you, because an actual call out from a group of people who really are less powerful like that is them saying ouch in the only way they can get it to register. And so if you can find another way to listen that doesn't have to be so dramatic, and if you're actually willing to make some kind of change, then often that's the way to diffuse the situation. But again, it's leaning into it, and it's valuing the other person's experience and what they're telling you.
Yes, absolutely. And it gets back to the ifs that you just said, but those are very important ifs. And
yes,
we all need to be more open. Positive intentions aren't enough. It's the actions that come outside of the positive intentions. You can say, well, I really did want to do that, but what do you really do? And the positive intentions don't mean a thing unless you add more substance behind them.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Which is extremely important, and we should do. Well, I have to tell you, this has been fun, and we went over our hour, but I'm not complaining. It was fun to do, but we've got to let you go get ready for dinner. It's getting closer to 5:00 there, and it'll be 5:00 soon enough, and then you can go off and decide if you're going to drink alone or with someone. Or whatever.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. This has been really great.
How do people reach out to you and learn about your program? I assume that you consult and coach with people all over the place.
I do indeed, and I have a website that's embodyequity.com.
There you go. Yeah. And they can contact you through that and have a discussion.
Yep, absolutely. I have a calendar link there, or there's an email. I'm also on Instagram at embodyequity. And I also, I have articles about a bunch of these kinds of things both on my website and then also on LinkedIn. So you can find Rie Gilsdorf on LinkedIn.
Well, anything you want us to include in show notes, please bring along and send over. And we would be glad to make sure that they get included. But I do really want to thank you, Rie, for being with us today. This has been a lot of fun. And I hope that you listening out there will also agree. Please let us know. We love to hear your comments. You can tell us we're great or not, or that you disagree, and that's perfectly okay. And we will respect that and hopefully open more discussions. And by the way, that also means if anyone, Rie, including you, knows of anyone who might make a good guest on Unstoppable Mindset, please let us know. We're always looking for more guests and ways to have discussions. And if you want to continue this one, Rie, we can have another discussion about it and do more of this. It would be kind of fun to do.
Fabulous.
But I'd like to, again, thank you. If you'd like to reach out to me wherever you are, please do so. You can email me, Michael H.I. at accessibe.com, ACCESSIBE.com, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. Definitely want to hear from you. And please, wherever you're listening, give us a 5-star rating. We really value those ratings. And when we see those, then we know somebody must like what we say, which is always a good thing. But again, Rie, thank you for being here with us and for taking so much time with us on Unstoppable Mindset.
All right. Thanks a lot.